We now have details regarding a trio of felony charges against Brendan Parsley, a school counselor for Dakota Prairie Schools who's been on administrative leave since November. They have a high school in Petersburg and elementary school in McVillie. He's charged with felonies of solicitation of a minor, luring minor by computer, and sexual assault. According to the criminal complaint, the charges involve two minor females. These are the allegations according to the criminal complaint. We'll read you the whole complaint here with the names of any investigators and or other victims omitted. Quote, on November 27, 2023, Nelson County Sheriff's Office requested the North Dakota Bureau of Criminal Investigation assist with the investigation of allegations of misconduct and sexual assault from a counselor at Dakota Prairie High School in Petersburg, North Dakota. The counselor was identified as Brendan Parsley. On December 1st, 2023, your affidavit interviewed Jane Doe 1 at the Nelson County Sheriff's Office. During the interview, Jane Doe 1 said she attended Dakota Prairie School from 2014 to 2015. While Jane Doe 1 was a student at the school, she sought counseling from Brendan Parsley, who was employed as a school counselor for Dakota Prairie School. She said counseling turned into a pretty flirty stuff, like Brendan Parsley standing close to Jane Doe 1 and Brendan Parsley blowing on Jane Doe 1's ear, which then led to after volleyball practice. When everyone left, Jane Doe 1 went to Brendan Parsley's office, where Parsley would hold Jane Doe 1 on his lap. Jane Doe 1 said things escalated during softball, saying she would go out of practice early and walk home. While she walked home, she passed Brendan Parsley's residence, where Jane Doe 1 saw Brendan Parsley motion to Jane Doe 1 to follow Brendan Parsley inside his house. Jane Doe 1 entered Brendan Parsley's residence and noticed Parsley's pants were unzipped. She said she remembered Brendan Parsley was wearing bright green boxers. Jane Doe 1 said Brendan Parsley asked Jane Doe 1, "Are you going to get on the bed?" Jane Doe 1 said she was 17 years old at the time and a virgin, so Jane Doe 1 was nervous. Jane Doe 1 said she hesitated. Then Brendan Parsley told Jane Doe 1, "Well, maybe then you should just go." Jane Doe 1 said Brendan Parsley and Jane Doe 1 hugged when Brendan's pants were unzipped. Jane Doe 1 told your affidavit she felt Brendan Parsley's erection while she and Brendan Parsley hugged inside Brendan Parsley's residence. Jane Doe 1 said a week and a half later, Jane Doe 1 drove by school and observed Brendan Parsley motion to Jane Doe 1 to follow Brendan Parsley again. Jane Doe 1 said she followed Brendan Parsley in her car. Jane Doe 1 said they just drove out of town and they stopped. Jane Doe 1 said she walked up to Brendan Parsley's truck, stood on the front rails, and talked. During the conversation, Jane Doe 1 said Brendan Parsley reached up and caressed me right under my arm and my boob, and we just kind of talked. Jane Doe 1 said there were missed phone calls from her mom, so Jane Doe 1 returned home. Later that night, Jane Doe 1's mother looked through Jane Doe's phone and noticed Facebook messages between Jane Doe 1 and Brendan Parsley. Jane Doe 1 couldn't remember the details of the conversation, but they were extremely inappropriate and were sexual conversations. Jane Doe 1 said her mother and superintendent had a meeting. Jane Doe 1 said Brendan Parsley admitted messaging Jane Doe 1 over Facebook and admitted to deleting all the Facebook messages. Your affidavit also interviewed Jane Doe 1's mother. During the interview, Jane Doe 1's mother said she contacted the superintendent about the messages. Jane Doe 1's mother saw on her Facebook messages with Brendan Parsley. Jane Doe 1's mother said she attended a meeting with Brendan Parsley and the superintendent. Jane Doe 1's mother said during the meeting, Brendan Parsley admitted to messaging Jane Doe 1 and later deleting those messages. On December 1st of 2023, your affidavit interviewed Jane Doe 2 at the Nelson County Sheriff's Office. During the interview, Jane Doe 2 said she attended Dakota Prairie School from 2007 to 2010. When Jane Doe 2 was a student at the school, she had sought counseling when Jane Doe 2 was a sophomore from Brendan Parsley, who was employed as a school counselor for Dakota Prairie School. Jane Doe 2 said during counseling sessions, Jane Doe 2 noticed the chairs were moved closer and Brendan Parsley would get closer. Jane Doe 2 said she felt safe with Brendan Parsley initially. Jane Doe 2 said at some point, Brendan Parsley would brush Jane Doe 2's hair back away from Jane Doe 2's neck. Jane Doe 2 said Brendan Parsley would get close to Jane 2 and stare. Jane Doe 2 said she would hold her legs together and Brendan Parsley would move up and put his legs on the outside of Jane Doe 2's legs, holding them together. Jane Doe 2 said Brendan Parsley would put his hands on my thighs and outwardly blow into Jane Doe 2's ear. Jane Doe 2 said there were multiple times when she was in a counseling session with Brendan Parsley. Jane Doe 2 would notice Brendan Parsley was aroused when Brendan Parsley leaned back in his chair. In his office, Jane Doe 2 said Brendan Parsley would look at himself and then nonchalantly tell Jane Doe 2 she did that to Brendan Parsley because of how pretty Jane Doe 2's eyes were. Jane Doe 2 said during one incident, she got up to leave Brendan Parsley's office during school, and Parsley came up behind her as she was standing. Jane Doe 2 said Brendan Parsley hugged Jane Doe 2 from behind. Then Brendan Parsley rubbed Jane Doe 2's vagina over her shorts. Jane Doe 2 said Brendan Parsley rubbed Jane Doe 2's vagina for approximately 30 seconds to a minute, and during that time, Jane Doe 2 said she could feel Brendan Parsley's erection on Jane Doe 2's lower back. Jane Doe 2 said she could also feel Brendan Parsley's breath on her neck when Brendan Parsley rubbed Jane Doe 2's vagina. Jane Doe 2 said Brendan Parsley and Jane Doe 2 had exchanged phone numbers. Jane Doe 2 said Brendan Parsley told her they can't tell anyone about this because it would ruin our lives. Jane Doe 2 said one time Brendan Parsley came to high school with bruised and swollen knuckles. Jane Doe 2 said Brendan Parsley would make sure Jane Doe 2 saw Brendan Parsley's swollen hands and tell Jane Doe 2 basically it is Jane Doe 2's fault if Jane Doe 2 doesn't respond or come to see Brendan Parsley in his office. Jane Doe 2 said after high school, Brendan Parsley would continue to send text messages. Jane Doe 2 said Brendan Parsley would threaten Jane Doe 2 that if Brendan Parsley couldn't speak with Jane Doe 2, he would hurt himself or threaten suicide. Jane Doe 2 told her affidavit Brendan Parsley called her on the phone and would be screaming and crying, telling Jane Doe 2 Brendan Parsley was sorry for touching Jane Doe 2 and being aroused in his office. Jane Doe 2 said Brendan Parsley manipulated and wrecked many years of her life, unquote. Again, that's from the affidavit of probable cause, the allegations against Brendan Parsley, who worked as a counselor at Dakota Prairie Schools. I'm Neil Carlson reporting for iNewZ.TV.